Our epistle reading for August the 16th comes from Romans chapter 11. The original lectionary has this reading from verse 1 to 2a, and then continuing on with 29 through 32. This section of Paul deals with how the Gentile community should interact with the Jewish community. This is important given the fact that Paul made an argument throughout most of the first Romans about how the law brings death and the Spirit brings life. Paul condemns the law not because the law does not serve a purpose, but because the law only comes to a certain point. It convicts us of our sin. It makes known God's will in our life. It reflects on how what we do and God's will is different. And then it shows us that there are consequences to that. But there is no remedy in the law. The sacrifices are to remind us of the cost, but it doesn't restore the relationship, which is why he says the law brings death. And the Spirit brings life, because Jesus remedies the situation. For if we cannot do it on our own, then Jesus has reconciled us with the Father, and the Holy Spirit is given to us so that the Holy Spirit working through us might do more than our sinful nature alone can do. Therefore, it's the strength of God within us that does what's good, not our own strength. And that's his entire argument. But because he's speaking to the Romans, because he's speaking to a primarily Gentile community, the idea then begins to emerge that, the law in the Old Testament, they're flawed, they're no good. And the Spirit in the New Testament is all that matters. And any Jew that doesn't accept this is doomed to death and destruction, and they deserve it. At which point Paul goes over and corrects the Gentiles' thinking in this chapter. So we begin with, I ask, then has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected people whom he foreknew. And then the lectionary skips down to, for the gifts of the and calling of God are irrevocable, just as you were disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience. So they have now been disobedient, in order that by mercy shown to you, they may too now receive mercy. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may be merciful to all. But it leaves out a chunk in the middle that I believe is important. It's a reminder of the fragility of our relationship with God, and that it is by grace alone and not a covenant that we are grafted on. And so I include verses 11 through 20 and then 23. So this is what I include. So I ask, have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means. But through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now notice he is bringing up this idea that grace bestowed upon the Gentiles, even though they are undeserving, should make those who are desperately trying to follow the law envious, just as those who hear Jesus on the cross turn to the thief and say, "Today you will be with me in paradise." It encourages us to be repentant, to seek God's mercy. And so this, like the law, is meant to lure those who still feel obligated to the law, but have no way to satisfy the law, seek the Spirit for themselves. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for Gentiles, how much more would their full inclusion mean? If those who have through generations been raised up in the law and obedience to God, then experience the freedom of the Holy Spirit to fulfill that law, how much more glorious will that be? Now, I am speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, one sent to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry in order to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. Notice the point is not the full salvation of the Gentiles, but to encourage those who've been looking for a Messiah to accept Jesus as their Messiah. For if their rejection means reconciliation for the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. The root, the call of Abraham. Abraham was justified by faith. That is the root. Moses, by faith, took the staff and went back into Egypt. He used a lot of excuses, but God said go, and he went by faith, and the people were delivered. By faith, they were asked to enter the promised land. And after first denial, they spent years until they had the faith strong enough to enter into that promised land. That's the root. The root is faith. Faith in the one God. For Abraham, there were some that talked but of a mighty God, but there wasn't a concept of one God over all gods, over all false gods, not just one true God. That's the root, that monotheism, that faith that God is God, that there is an ultimate reality, and God is that ultimate reality. And we exist within that reality. And it's not separate, but it dictates our life. We do not dictate the life of God. Understanding that and obedience to that and worship of that as God, as the universal. Those are the roots that he talks about. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share in the richness of the olive tree, so by the grace of God and Jesus Christ, you have been given salvation by faith to be rooted on to that story of salvation. And in their place to share the riches of the olive tree. Do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember, it's not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. We don't dismiss the teachings of Abraham and Moses, of Isaiah and Ezekiel. We don't ignore the lessons of the prophets and the stories of the people. That's the root that we are grafted onto. And they have as much to teach us as they do the people who belong to the family. You will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast only through faith. So don't be proud, but stand in awe. Our covenant is a covenant sealed by faith. It is our faith that saves us. And God's grace alone that makes that possible. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And that is in verse 21. And even the others, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. So even though we are saved by faith alone, the sacrificial system is ended in Jesus. It still means we need to study the Old Testament. For these are people who dedicated their lives trying to follow God. And they fell into the same temptations we all do. Whether that is pride, whether that is lust, they fall into the same temptations. And so we can learn from them and seek the power of the Holy Spirit to help guide us in our weakness, to help strengthen us when we are about to fall. Don't dismiss the Old Testament, but by the same token, know that we are grafted on by faith and that the sacrificial system has been satisfied in Jesus. So don't try to be Jewish, for we're not, if you're like me and a Gentile. We don't belong under the covenant of sacrifice, but we belong under the covenant of faith in Jesus' sacrifice for us. It's an important distinction, because if we begin to try to live out the Old Testament, including the sacrificial system, then we fall right back into the same thinking of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as if Jesus had never come to start with. But Jesus has come, so things have changed. But just because they've changed doesn't mean that the faithfulness and struggle contained in the Old Testament and the words of God to the people of the Old Testament do not apply to us as well. And all the promises contained in the prophets apply to us as well. If we are faithful in Deuteronomy, then it will be well with us in the land. If we are faithful. That is what Paul is trying to get at in this section of Romans.